So we begin with a massive update, one of I would say enormous proportion. I can't emphasize that enough. This came to us thanks to our good friend Matt Rissman. Lucasfilm creative executive Pablo Hidalgo has revealed some massive information about the Kenobi show in a rare interview. This might come as a major surprise to most fans, especially considering how Obi-Wan Kenobi Season 1 was very controversial. Mixed reviews, some saying it's been one of the worst Disney Plus shows, but apparently not to George Lucas. Around the 15-minute, 59-second mark of his conversation with the SSW network, Hidalgo says George was consulted a few times during production, and not just this, he loved the final product. He resonated with the story, and Hidalgo reveals it's one of George's favourite things Disney has done with his former brand, the continuation of the characters he once created. I'm sure he loved seeing Ewan and Hayden reprise their roles. Hidalgo also mentions George loved the fact Leia Organa was a major focus, something he had always intended to do more with. So, how is this going to sit with fans? Well, it may be a bit shocking, especially to those fans who profess to be George Lucas purists, because amongst so many original trilogy and prequels fans, this was not a very popular show. But if you understand George and take him at his word, it makes sense. At the end of the day, George always said he was far more proud of what he accomplished in episodes 1, 2 and 3 than 4, 5 and 6. And taking into account the fact George had very mixed feelings about the sequel trilogy, a couple of years ago he said, "Those films, they're not my story, they're not mine. 1 to 6 are." And considering the prequel trilogy was pretty much one of the last things he did, along with the Clone Wars, returning to that time period for him may have been a sigh of relief. And the reality is this, we don't know what George would have done had he made the same kind of series. He was always about switching up the aesthetic, changing things, questioning what you think you know. We have no idea, had he not sold Lucasfilm, how his own Kenobi show would have panned out. Because keep in mind, George loved experimenting, and he wanted to do some wild things with Star Wars. You might even say despite the fact there were some very, very unpopular decisions in the Disney series, it might be rather tame compared to what George would have imagined. And I should also say we're assuming Pablo is telling the full truth and telling the full version of events. And if he's right, something he brings up is the fact this is a time period after Revenge of the Sith that both George and the fans have imagined in their mythology for years. We had a Legends book, and as a fandom we all had our own ideas of what that would have looked like. And according to Pablo, Mr. Lucas was fully on board. Another very interesting thing Pablo brings up is the fact very early on when they were interfacing with George, they asked him flat out, "Do you like this idea? What do you think? Should we do more with Obi-Wan and Vader before A New Hope?" And according to Pablo's words, he was fully supportive of the idea. And because, as Hidalgo says, he recognises so much of what he did between 1999 and 2005, this is amongst his favourite things Disney Star Wars has done. Other projects he's enjoyed, or reportedly enjoyed, are Rogue One. We know he didn't like The Force Awakens. He described The Last Jedi as a beautiful movie but never commented on the story. And we know from his own words, from things we've heard from other sources, while he's supportive of Disney doing more with the brand, he's distanced himself from recent stories. But he did visit the set of Mando, Dave Filoni consults him for advice, and there was a crazy, wild rumour stating he might be returning for an upcoming live-action project, although I don't see the benefit to him. I just don't see it happening. Over the years we've heard so many rumours like this one. But who knows? All I'll say is this, it does come as a massive surprise that George reportedly loved the Kenobi show, but if you really listen to his actual words, his creative ideas, it kind of makes sense. And there's also the fact, as I say, these are OG characters, ones he cares about more than most. Interesting stuff. I know this might sound very strange, but in the fandom we tend to mythologize so much of what we assume is George Lucas, forgetting his actual words, forgetting his approach to Star Wars and kind of imposing our ideas of what we think he would do. But his approach blended classical mythology with modern technology and effects. Drawing from Akira Kurosawa, Joseph Campbell, he tried to create a modern myth, archetypal characters. So while fans have criticised him for his dialogue and execution of certain character tropes, the man knows how to write a blooming good story, one which can resonate across generations. And central to that is being imaginative. Creating such a vast universe is going to come with some things which are brand new. And I do feel as though many fans hold him to the fact Star Wars has to be this very boxed in thing, it has to just be this one type of story. But I don't think he would see it that way. So when there is a narrative that Star Wars deviates from what we call George Lucas Star Wars, I don't even think George Lucas would keep to George Lucas Star Wars, if that makes sense. I think we've been under the assumption that if George had made a Kenobi show, it would have been Obi-Wan watching over Luke, and very much what John Jackson Miller did in the Legends book, staying rooted on Tatooine, Obi-Wan's interactions with the Tuskens, the locals going to the cantina. But George, as I say, loved to switch things up. We know for a fact he wanted to do more with Qui-Gon Jinn. He wanted to explore the Force Ghost aspect. But that doesn't mean there wouldn't have been new characters as well. The Reaver type of characters. Would George have done the Inquisitors a bit different? I would say probably. And the Disney canon way of exploring the early days of the Empire I think is very different to how George originally imagined. The impact of the new regime. And remember that George Lucas's thoughts and opinions may have changed over the years. So while he's apparently said he liked the Kenobi show and the direction Deborah Chow went in, that doesn't mean it was what he originally envisioned. And I'm thinking more specifically about Obi-Wan versus Vader before A New Hope. Would he have avoided such an encounter? Should they have done another Obi-Wan versus Maul fight before his death in Star Wars Rebels? And this was one of the major gripes that fans had with the Kenobi show. The fact Obi-Wan and Vader are not supposed to meet between the time period of Mustafar and the Death Star in Episode 4. That's why Vader says, "When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master." But again, George wasn't as concerned with maintaining canon and continuity as some fans assume. It was always about how it worked within a project, the convenience of it, and ultimately how it looked. He's a story and visual effects kind of guy, above all else. He retcons stuff all the time. So that's why I'm thinking, maybe it's not as surprising as we assumed, that the Kenobi show spoke to him, that he liked it. But I think something George Lucas would have brought to it if he was in charge, if he had never sold Lucasfilm, or they brought him on for a more hands-on role, is the spiritual journey Obi-Wan faced during his exile. One of the things I always assumed was central to Obi-Wan's reflective meditation in his time on Tatooine was the pain, the PTSD. There was some of it, there were visions and dreams as he comes to terms with his past. This is something George wanted to see explored in more depth, and the fact Leia was the catalyst for teaching him a renewed sense of hope was exactly up George's alley. He wanted a connection between the two characters, so by the time of A New Hope, there is a deeper reason Leia cares that Obi-Wan is there with Luke. And something I'm sure we would have gotten with George Lucas's version is Commander Cody, which was in the earlier scripts before they made Kenobi into a show instead of a trilogy of films. And I'm almost certain we probably would have seen Watto, or some kind of reunion with Jar Jar Binks. As unpopular as that might sound to some, those characters would have meant a lot to George. He loved the comic relief. And I'm also convinced we would have gotten a ton more aliens, maybe coming across some Mos Eisley Cantina figures 10 years earlier in the timeline. So to that extent, I'm sure fans feel as though George would have brought a bit more familiarity, but he was not shy to bring in new characters and new concepts. So there you go. We may have had another prequel trilogy situation on our hands. Fans initially reacting with revilement and saying this isn't Star Wars I know. George was not afraid to push the envelope. That is the main point I'm trying to make. This series spoke to him, and it's going to be interesting to see fan reactions. But I want to know what you guys think. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments down below. Please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video. May the Force be with you, always.